Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. This discussion is going to take a slightly different tack. So it's actually been quite well orchestrated by chance, I think, but it works really well because we've had very distinct sector specifics. I'm now going to talk a little bit more about carbon pricing instruments as a mechanism for business, as opposed to any sector-specific point. So just a little bit, I work for IETA, the International Emission Trading Association. It's a membership-based association, and members join IETA because carbon markets are important to them. Carbon trading schemes, emission trading schemes, carbon pricing schemes, and they are involved in those schemes along the full value chain of the market. And we really try and represent the view of business in the work that we do. So this is a very complicated slide and you're not supposed to read it all, so I'm going to zoom in on it in a minute. But before I do that, I wanted to just set up carbon pricing, because I think we sometimes take a jump of logic in what carbon pricing is. So first of all, why do we need carbon pricing? Just quick reminder that the advantage of putting a price on carbon means you make emissions more expensive and help make the business case for low carbon. This is critical for business because otherwise there is no business case to decarbonize. There may be good intentions and we may all want to be part of the Paris Agreement, but there needs to be a business case to satisfy fiduciary responsibilities of boards. So you do need that business case. And at the same time, the act of decarbonizing for companies is extraordinarily difficult. It's difficult for countries, but it's particularly difficult for corporates who need to maintain quarterly financial returns. But at the same time, decarbonizing is an interconnected problem. It's a problem of interconnected supply chains and interconnected technology, interconnected economics of the availability of that technology. So you may have the best intent in the world as a company to decarbonize, but unless you can work with your peers and your suppliers to do that, it's very difficult and I would say impossible to do it in isolation. And so we need these processes or these mechanisms across the industry to help create that business case. So when we look at carbon pricing, we more or less, this is generalizing a bit to make the point, but we generally split them into carbon markets and carbon taxes. Now, across both of those instruments, there are trading mechanisms that can be used, like allowances and carbon credits. But just to walk through it, and I'm just going to go a little bit closer in to make this easier. So within carbon markets, we have compliance markets, and that's what we've been talking a lot about today, the emission trading schemes. It's not only the emission trading schemes and compliance markets, you also get offsetting schemes. So it's great we had the airlines talking, Aer Lingus, because CORSIA, which is the carbon offset reduction of the aviation industry, is a carbon offsetting scheme for the aviation industry. And then also within carbon markets, you have voluntary carbon markets, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then on the far right-hand side, you have carbon tax schemes, and some countries have both operating. We were hearing that a few times today. You can have multiple of these mechanisms operating simultaneously. So to put it in perspective a little then, how big are these schemes? So the compliance schemes, in terms of traded value, are worth about 880 billion. And a large portion of that is the ETS by country mile. The voluntary carbon market, which sometimes is, disproportionately covered in the media, is actually a very tiny 2% of that. So when you hear people talking about the voluntary carbon market, it's still very small. It has a potential to get much bigger, but it is very tiny. And then in terms of that bar, the hashed lines are where carbon credits are traded. The solid orange is all on allowances. So carbon credits actually makes up a smaller amount of the overall traded instruments. Now, I know this gives you grey hairs, Ian, in terms of talking about emerging policies and the growth of emission trading schemes. So let's just, but there is a good point to this as well. So if we take the left-hand chart, the World Bank chart, what that's showing is that carbon tax schemes and emission trading schemes together, there are 75 different schemes around the world, and they cover 24% of global emissions. So that's not bad. I mean, these schemes are growing and they are evolving and they are starting to have a real impact. And the right-hand chart, which is the ICAP chart, that shows the growth in emission trading schemes. So we have 38 emission trading schemes around the world and a further 11 underway. And so, yes, that starts complicating our lives as businesses, because if you're a multinational operating across these different schemes, you have a range of different policy instruments and regulations that you need to understand and come to terms with. ETS is definitely evolving as a preferred policy mechanism, and already 58% of global GDP falls under an emission trading scheme. So these are very real instruments that are available to business to help them decarbonize and affecting them as businesses operating in multiple jurisdictions. It doesn't stop there. We then have, under the United Nations, we have within the Paris Agreement, we also have a trading mechanism. And this mechanism, the rules have just been finalized, and there's two parts to this mechanism. This can also, it's primarily for governments to deliver their national contributions, but it also impacts companies in a variety of ways. I won't go into that in too much detail, or we'll never leave. And then finally, we have the voluntary carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market is going through quite an evolution. This is a really important market because it is first and foremost for corporates to help you decarbonize at a lower cost and at greater speed. So it's there as an aid to supplement your internal reduction activities. But it is going through a transition, and there are a number of integrity initiatives, both on the supply side and on the demand side, to help build robustness in this market. But we're real advocates for this market, and although it has been problematic, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is an important instrument for corporates to use, an important tool in the toolkit. So the challenge of all this interconnectedness means it is very complicated for companies. And this chart tries to explain that just very briefly. So the use of the instrument dictates the rules. So if you're using the instrument to deliver your NDC, you have to have that instrument authorized, and it's got to have a corresponding adjustment so the greenhouse gas accounting books work. You need to use a certain type of credit. If you are following CORSIA, you've got a set of rules. If you're following the voluntary, if you're using the credit purely for voluntary, there's another sort of set of guidelines and integrity labels that you should be following. So it makes it complicated, and there's definitely room for simplification here. We have not made our lives easy, and we've certainly not helped make business easy. But part of this is because the infrastructure of the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up one. So countries are developing mechanisms and schemes bottom-up as opposed to sort of global initiatives. And many companies operate globally. So you've got conflicting ways of developing climate policy going on. So really, what are we looking for here as corporates? We're looking for convergence between these schemes. We are needing to simplify, and we need the ability to trade across jurisdictions, build liquidity, and help deliver emission reductions as fast as possible and at lowest cost. it really is tricky for companies, and it's clear that we're behind. We hear a lot of fantastic stories. Normally, if you come to conferences like this, you hear from the companies who are doing all the right things. But a few statistics for you. 80% of the world's largest companies have not yet set a net zero target. Of all the companies who reported to CDP, who are generally, again, quite leading companies who report disclosures into CDP, 25% of those companies have not set 1.5-degree pathways. So we can't fool ourselves that we can just keep building rigor and rigidity. We have to help companies get on board and simplify the rules in order to do that. Make the rules of the game very clear, and we need regulators to help give safe harbor to companies. What I mean by that is the rules of the game must be clear. The way you can use carbon markets, especially if you're using them for a voluntary basis, needs to be very, very clear. And the claims that you can make for the use of those carbon credits needs to be very clear. And I think that will really help significantly.